Welcome. Thank you all for joining us for our Regional Reflections on Green Infrastructure and Nature-Based Solutions series. Today, we will be featuring green infrastructure projects from the Southwest. I'm Rebecca Eicher, a project director with the American Association for the Advancement of Science's Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues, also known as the AAAS EPI Center. The AAAS's EPI Center mission is to bring clear, concise, and actionable scientific evidence to decision makers. We are honored to be co-hosting this conversation about green infrastructure and nature-based solutions in partnership with our colleagues from the U.S. EPA Office of Water, the Green Infrastructure Federal Collaborative, and the White House. This discussion is an exciting opportunity to hear about successes, challenges, and opportunities from the design and planning phases to implementation to operations and maintenance of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions in the Southwest. We have a wonderful set of speakers today, and I'm happy to introduce one of our partners, Robin DeYoung from the U.S. EPA Office of Water, who will share about the Green Infrastructure Federal Collaborative.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here with you today. And we are, first I want to thank Rebecca and AAAS staff for organizing today's webinar. And, also thanks to the speakers. I am really excited to hear about their insights on how they've been able to advance green infrastructure in the Southwest. And if this is the fifth of the Regional Reflections, Nature-Based Solutions webinars that we've done. And so if this is going to be just as good as the other ones, I know you guys are going to love it. I'm at US EPA. I'm our Green Infrastructure Program lead at the Environmental Protection Agency. And I am organizing our Green Infrastructure Federal Collaborative. We reestablished this in May of this year. And it's a community of practice that comprises of over a dozen federal agencies that work in the field of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. And we actually just had our quarterly meeting yesterday to continue to align our knowledge and resources so that we can help communities build capacity and maximize the environmental, economic, and social benefits. So, when Rebecca came to us and said, I really want to do this regional webinar series, we were all over it because we know that there's all these unique opportunities in different parts of the regions. So I'm really thrilled that EPA is partnering with AAAS and the White House on talking about these success stories. So if I'm going to put the Green Infrastructure Federal Collaborative link in the chat so you can keep up to date with new regional webinars. And I'm also going to put our EPA listserv in the chat, which gives you updates. There's already 7,000 people that are signed on, and it gives you updates on other potential webinars and resources that are available on green infrastructure. So thanks again. Looking forward to the wonderful conversation. Back to you, Rebecca.
Thank you. Before we move on to our presentations, a bit on logistics for the day. We really encourage you to use the chat. So please introduce yourselves, the organization that you're calling in from, share your ideas, resources, and experiences. Additionally, we have the Q&A box available. Please put your questions for the presenters in that Q&A box. We want this discussion to be interactive, so we encourage you to ask questions and share ideas. We hope to get to as many questions as possible, but we can't promise we will get to all the questions. Please do reach out to us at the AAAS EPI Center with any follow-up questions. And for those of you attending this webinar live, you will receive a follow-up email with the link to the recording of this webinar, as well as the saved version of the chat. So our speakers, their bios, their slides, those will all be available after the webinar on the AAAS EPI Center webpage with the recording, slides, and bios of our speakers. With that, we can move on to the exciting part where we get to start hearing from some different folks. So I'm honored to introduce Dr. Lydia Olander Director for Nature-Based Resilience and co-lead of the Coastal Resilience Interagency Working Group at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. In addition to her role, she is also co-chairing an administration report on nature-based solutions. She's on loan to CEQ from Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability. We won't have any slides from her today, but we are happy to have her remarks and expertise. Welcome, Dr. Olander.
Thank you, Rebecca. On behalf of the White House, it's really great to be here, and I really want to thank AAAS and EPA for this terrific webinar series. It's been fantastic and really contributing to the dialogue on nature-based solutions. So nature-based solutions are a priority for this administration. A member of the White House has been on each of these calls to share what we're doing and to learn more from all of you about how we can do more. President Biden, in his first week in office, introduced Executive Order 14008 on tackling the climate crisis, recognizing that addressing climate change requires whole-of-government action. The executive order established the Domestic Climate Policy Office, headed by Gina McCarthy, and a National Climate Task Force, which is made up of cabinet members and executive offices of presidential leadership. The executive order focuses on decarbonizing and transitioning our economy, but it also places an equal emphasis on resilience through nature and conservation. For example, it includes the America the Beautiful initiative, which commits to conserve 30% of the land mass and 30% of the oceans by 2030. Climate smart agriculture and forestry, and creation of a civilian climate corps, also focused on nature and helping nature to serve its natural role in curbing climate change, while it also protects and sustains nature. In response to this executive order, 5 interagency working groups were formed to focus on climate hazards, adaptation, and resilience. These include extreme heat, flooding, drought, wildfire, and coastal resilience. The Coastal Resilience Interagency Working Group recognized early on that nature-based solutions have a vital role to play in advancing the nation's coastal resilience. And as a result of this they produced a compendium of federal nature-based resources for coastal communities, states, tribes, and territories, which is available online. And I think Rebecca will be putting a link into the chat. It lists case studies, guides, tools, and funding opportunities. And I should say that these are not just for the coastal systems. A lot of these resources cover all different kinds of systems, so I think they would be relevant, a number of them, for the Southwest as well. On Earth Day this year, the Biden-Harris administration also released an executive order, 14072, on strengthening the nation's forests, communities, and local economies. It specifically called out the importance of deploying nature-based solutions as a key part of our approach to tackling climate change. And it called for a report on nature-based solutions, identifying opportunities for greater deployment of nature-based solutions across the federal government, including through potential policy guidance, program changes, and this is to be submitted to the National Climate Task Force. The report will make recommendations on how the federal government can help to address constraints and accelerate adoption to nature-based solutions. Agencies and states, local governments, tribes, territories all have the opportunity to make new investments in nature-based solutions with support from funding in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act. So it's an opportune time to take advantage of this wide range of funding opportunities to support nature-based solutions. We have lots of resources that can help bring our minds together and think big, develop large proof of concept projects that showcase the value of nature-based solutions, and create new pathways to scale up the use of nature-based solutions. The bipartisan infrastructure bill has a number of programs and funding that's already rolling out. There's over $3 billion for wildfire risk reduction, over $2 billion in ecosystem restoration, and over $1 million for Western water multi-benefit projects to improve watershed health. And the Inflation Reduction Act will invest $24.9 billion to help farmers, ranchers, and forest owners adopt climate smart conservation that enhance landscape resilience. And this will invest in conservation programs and private forest management programs, as well as fire management. And USDA is going to also have urban and community forestry programs and tree planting to cool neighborhoods through these programs. There's also a program that will invest $2 billion into improve walkability, safety, and affordable transportation, which includes funding for multi-use trails and regional greenways, natural infrastructure for stormwater, and reduction and mitigating heat. So lots of opportunities for nature-based solutions in this funding that'll be coming out shortly. We're really excited to have you all helping to advance this community of practice that you all are part of, bringing together the knowledge and experience we need to see rapid growth in the nature-based solutions that are required to address the dual challenges of climate change and nature loss. So thank you all for what you do, and I'll turn it back over to Rebecca.
Thank you, Lydia. It's exciting to hear about the administration's interest and commitment to green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. As a reminder, go ahead and put any questions you have for Lydia and all of our upcoming presenters in the Q&A box. We're going to get started, but I see questions already coming in, which is fantastic. So next up, we have Blue Baldwin, who is the Storm to Shade Program Manager for the City of Tucson in Arizona. Blue joined Tucson Water in 2021 to help build the City of Tucson's first green stormwater infrastructure program, which puts stormwater to beneficial use as an additional component of Tucson's diverse One Water resource portfolio. Blue, welcome.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning, or not good morning, I'm sorry. Good day, everyone. I know there are people here from all over the time zones of the world. Thank you for having me. I just want to open by saying that I'm very honored to be involved and invited to be part of this conversation. I was loving listening to Lydia, who represents our federal government, and the White House use the term nature-based solutions over and over again, and to hear about how trees are part of the conversation and walkability is part of the conversation, because what we're doing here in all these conversations really are about holistic, large systems that tap all of the benefits that nature can bring us. And so thank you. I'm really excited to be here and to represent a small green stormwater infrastructure program based in Tucson, Arizona. We are nestled in the City of Tucson's Tucson Water Department. And so let's proceed to the next slide. So I like to open with this slide, and I know that it's a very busy slide with a lot of information. I really just want to point out with this slide the recent timeline that surrounds this movement to build a green stormwater infrastructure program housed within the City of Tucson. If you look down at the little color key on the bottom left, you'll see that that very top box, the purple box, symbolizes community and/or University of Arizona actions around water harvesting and/or what we are now calling green stormwater infrastructure. So as you can see, starting in the 2000s, if not before, that's up for debate, there were a lot of pushes and activity around harvesting rainwater for beneficial use in the community. And in fact, folks in Tucson started doing that even before it was legal. They started cutting curbs and allowing stormwater running along the edges of city streets into the landscape to support native vegetation. There is one certain individual in our community named Brad Lancaster who wrote the book Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond, which is right there around under 2002, 2003. And this book is really sort of the tome of DIY rainwater harvesting practices for folks at home. And so Brad was really one of the pioneers in this work from the grassroots effort. The U of A has also been very active in this area for a very long time. And then if you move along the timeline, you'll see that then the Tucson region started picking up on this and seeing like, oh, this is working. This is a solution that has a lot of benefits, and we can share these. We can institutionalize them, create policy around them, and share them with the community legally rather than pre-legally. And so you see that start to pick up. And then when you see further along the timeline, starting around 2010, anything that's in white is something that the City of Tucson's mayor and council initiated. And so we see the adoption of a commercial rainwater harvesting ordinance, the adoption of a water conservation fee on Tucson water customers' bills. And so all of this to say, Tucson is a pretty special place in terms of this ethic around using rainwater and harvested stormwater for beneficial use in the community. And then if you skip all the way to the end, you'll see circled in red is the city of Tucson hires GSI program staff. So that is when our program actually launched. It was created at the direction of mayor and council in 2019, but because of COVID, was not able to actually get off the ground. And so we've been around for just over 1.5 years at this point. So huge disclaimer, we're brand new, we're figuring things out as we go along, and we're learning a lot as we go. Next slide, please. So this is just an overview of what the GSI program that was established was intended to do. Number one, to establish a capital improvement program to build GSI throughout the 6 wards of the city. Number two, to maintain existing and any new GSI that the program builds. This is huge. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this very tricky maintenance conversation. And it was very clear off the bat that maintenance was going to be a significant part of this program. And number 3 was to prioritize equity and vulnerable communities. So really with a focus on those communities that need green stormwater infrastructure the most. And then the lovely graphic just is what we use in our public outreach to show all of the wonderful co-benefits of GSI. Next one, please. So the City of Tucson's Tucson Water Department also adopted stormwater as one of its many water resources to be managed accordingly. So this is just to show that stormwater is officially in our water management plan and portfolio. Next, please. So the goals of the program were to capture, clean, and infiltrate stormwater, to shade and cool surfaces and buildings, so mitigating urban heat island effect, which, as you can imagine, in Tucson, Arizona, is a very real thing, to reduce minor nuisance flooding, to create wildlife habitat and support biodiversity, and to improve overall environmental quality and the quality of life for communities. So kind of hearkening back to a couple of the things that Lydia was saying, this is about making our community cooler, more comfortable, greener, more usable for communities, for really trying to bring up the quality of life in the environment for the people that live here in Tucson. And I will just make note, none of these bullets addresses regulatory drivers. So we were not regulatory driven. This program was not established to address our MS4 permit. We can talk more about that later. Next slide, please. We do have a dedicated funding source. So the way that it works is every Tucson water utility customer living within the city limits of Tucson receives a small fee on their water bill or their utility bill. It's utility because there are several other services that are provided. But the fee is based on 13 cents per CCF of water consumed. And that averages out to be about $1 extra on folks' bills. So a pretty easy sum to swallow. That amasses us approximately $6 million annually as our budget to spend toward building new green stormwater infrastructure and maintaining what already exists and any new infrastructure we build. We can go to the next slide. So as far as the building new stuff is concerned, our capital process and prioritization, where do we begin? So what we did first was, as timing would have it, a couple of propositions passed recently, and they were for parks and connections improvements. And so we looked at that list of where greenways were being built, where bike boulevards were being enhanced, or pedestrian safety corridor projects, or park improvements. And we looked to find projects where we could dovetail with those existing improvements and add green stormwater infrastructure to improve the project overall. So for instance, our very first project, which is under construction right now, note we don't have anything yet built, nothing is in the ground, but we're under construction with our first, is a portion of a very large park that's getting, I believe, $7 million worth of investment for new lighting, new fields, new track, new irrigation system, a splash pad, new bathrooms. And we were able to look at this park and say, hey, what about this patch, this really long stretch of what would just be Bermuda grass? And Bermuda grass generally doesn't do that great in Tucson anyway. We thought maybe we should deturf this area, pull water off of the adjacent very large street through the right of way via sidewalk scuppers into the park, direct it to a very long swale where we can add an additional 60 native trees to the park and a ton of native vegetation, pollinators. A place where people can interact with a more natural native Sonoran desert environment. And we're not paying for water to irrigate grass. And we are collecting stormwater off the street, addressing water quality issues, et cetera. So that's sort of the spirit of what we're trying to do. We also work very closely with each of the 6 ward offices in Tucson because they are the folks closest to the ground, to connecting with community, and they know where those areas are in their communities that need love, that need support, that need more green space, that need more trees, that need more shade. And so our large pot of funding is divided equally across each of the 6 ward offices, and then with one allocation for the mayor's office as well. So that's how we focus our projects. We also partner with a couple of other entities in our region. So we are in Pima County. Pima County Regional Flood Control District is the entity that deals with large flooding of storm events and builds retention detention basins to deal with those. We've established a really great relationship with them where they're now looking to build facilities inside of the city limits. Often they're projects that are beyond the scale that we can address as a smaller program. But our agreement is if they build it, we'll maintain it over the long run, which is a huge win, certainly for them, but also for us because it's an incentive for them to build more within the city. We also work really closely with a couple of community partners, namely Tucson Clean and Beautiful, which has what I think of as sort of our little sister program, which is about building green stormwater infrastructure projects in neighborhoods. But those projects are driven by community members and neighborhoods. And so we love to collaborate with them as often as possible to support each other's projects however we can, whether that be through additional funds or outreach efforts. Yes, all sorts of good things. And then we use a tool to prioritize our investment that's called the Tree Equity Score. The Tree Equity Score is a mashup of GIS data layers that include tree canopy, heat index, and then also other environmental indicators of vulnerability, but then also socioeconomic demographic indicators. And we will pop to the next slide, and I believe that I will be showing you this. Yes, so here's our tree equity score map for Tucson. You can see each of the city is divided into the 6 wards here, and the colors indicate what the approximate score is in that little polygon. So the deepest, darkest orange colors indicate a very low tree equity score, meaning a lot of impermeable surface, low tree canopy, and vulnerable populations. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you've got those bright green boxes, and that's where populations are generally more affluent and there's more tree canopy. So what we do is, because our funding is divided equally across these 6 wards, we look within each ward at where the investment is needed most. So if you look at Ward 6, right, smack dab there in the middle, Ward 6 has the highest tree equity score overall for Tucson. I'm sorry, but there are still spots in Ward 6 that really need some more investment. So that's how we work with the tree equity score tool. Next slide, please. Moving on to our maintenance program. This has been an amazing project with a ton of support from the University of Arizona. And I saw that Andrea Gerlach joined the call. We were able to partner with the University of Arizona for a project to create a maintenance protocol for the city of Tucson. I'm not going to go deeply into that because I don't have time, but the outcomes of that partnership were really significant. We were able to train 230 people, both City of Tucson staff and individuals from the community, in the proper maintenance of green stormwater infrastructure, because that looks really different from traditional landscaping. We have also, our program, the Storm to Shade program, has hired 6 maintenance contractors that will work specifically for the Storm to Shade program on maintaining GSI. They are GSI specialists, and this is their primary focus. We are also working very closely with other departments within the city of Tucson, like Tucson Water, Parks, Department of Transportation Mobility, those other departments that might touch green stormwater infrastructure, but may not have the training or resources to properly handle it when they do have to interact with it. And so we are working on dividing up exactly what they're responsible for and what we can take away from them, take off of their plates and handle with our more expert maintenance forces. We're presently building a very snazzy enterprise asset management system for green stormwater infrastructure. And we are currently putting together our prioritization criteria for the sites that we will be able to maintain, which is tricky because there's a lot out there, but we have a small budget. And so we really have to be intentional about deciding what we're going to tackle first. And hopefully we'll grow and be able to take on more and more in years to come. Finally, we published a GSI maintenance pocket guide, which there should be a link to in the chat. It is available for everyone as a PDF. I see Social just popped a link to it in the chat. So if you're interested in seeing that, you can open it up, you can download it, you can print it, you can share it widely, laminate it. We would love for it to get as far out into the community as possible. That's what we made it for. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, please. So challenges, maintenance presents a lot of challenges. One is that GSI assets are owned across various departments in the city. This one that we see in this picture, for instance, would be under the Department of Transportation Mobility's jurisdiction because it is in a street. So how do we coordinate with those other departments when the actual assets live in streets or in parks or on Tucson water well sites? So we're working hard on that. And it takes a lot of communication that I guess we'll just say is not the standard at this point. So we're making a lot of new friends and having a lot of novel conversations. Departments use different asset management systems that don't communicate with one another. And in some cases, they don't have asset management systems at all. So that's another big challenge that we're addressing. Then competing interests in different protocols. On Tucson water well sites, for instance, if there's GSI, it has to have certain setbacks from the well monitoring equipment. And so we really need to talk those kinds of logistical situations out. Another example is police and unsheltered folks. There are regulations around the kind of vegetation that can be in parks so that our officers are able to see through parks and there aren't places for folks to basically camp out. And this is a really challenging topic because we want people to be able to find refuge and shade. And at the same time, that comes with all sorts of other implications and really big and sticky conversations that we're working really hard as a city on addressing. And then landscape maintenance contractors. There simply aren't enough of them out there that understand green stormwater infrastructure, that don't just have that mow, blow, and go mentality, which is like antithesis to what we're trying to do. And so we're really working on trying to cultivate those skills and that workforce. Next slide, please. So challenges and barriers, sort of dovetailing on the last comment. There simply are not enough people out there that know how to design GSI, that know how to build GSI, and that know how to maintain GSI. So we really need to find ways to partner with organizations that can help us build that workforce. We also need to build our own internal capacities via ongoing trainings for City of Tucson staff that touch GSI landscapes at any point in their jobs. And then there are the contractors. And how do we loop them in and bring them into the conversation and make sure that they are adhering to best practices for the maintenance of GSI protocol and not getting themselves and us in huge amounts of trouble for butchering trees. So we're, in a nutshell, so we are requiring them to take training, the ones that we've hired at least, and we're writing accountability into those contracts. And then finally, talking about metrics and what we like to call dream data. The metrics that we know we will be able to report out on and want to be monitoring are how much pavement we're pulling up and replacing with green stormwater infrastructure, how many gallons of water we're pulling off of impervious surfaces and putting back in the ground. And then we don't have these set up yet, but we would love to be able to see how we're able to increase tree canopy over time, how we're able to impact ambient temperature over time and cool the urban environment, countering that urban heat island effect. How are we able to impact air and water quality? Are we collecting, is GSI collecting trash that is then collected by our maintenance workers and not making its way to our significant waterways? And then finally, our program was not set up to address our MS4 permit, but it could eventually over time. And so we are in conversations with all of the other folks and entities about how we can dovetail to support one another. And that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you. This is really exciting and inspiring to hear about all the work happening in Tucson. So really appreciate it. Next up, we have Sarah Hurto, the Executive Director of Integrated Biological Solutions and co-founder of the Arid LID Coalition. Sarah has worked as a conservation biologist focused on wildlife and forested systems since 2002. For the past 9 years, her work has shifted to more urban ecology issues, integrating climate adaptation strategies to reduce impacts to both people and nature. Welcome, Sarah. Uh-oh, you're muted.
Thank you, Rebecca. I got unmuted this time. As Blue said, it's really an honor to be part of this panel and presenting in this webinar. And I first just want to take this opportunity to say that all of the work that I'll be presenting today took place on the ancestral lands of the Tewa people in the Middle Rio Grande Valley of New Mexico. And while I am the one that's presenting this work, this is by no means my work. It's the work of the coalition. And the coalition is such a huge part of the success of green stormwater infrastructure in Albuquerque. So I want to take you back. I didn't team up with Blue and both start with timelines, although apparently great minds think alike. So our coalition sort of had its origins based in our MS4 permit in 2014. The EPA designated the Albuquerque Middle Rio Grande watershed as a watershed-based permit, and it was one of only a handful of these that were designated by the EPA. And so we have more than 15 organizations and municipalities that all report under a single MS4 permit. This is a unique situation that has allowed all of these agencies to really join together and really benefit from the collaboration that happens with this single watershed permit. So I started with the Nature Conservancy in 2016 and led their urban conservation program for many years. And under that role, I co-founded the Arid LID Coalition with a handful of people that are on this call today in 2017. And the mission of the group really was to increase the use of green stormwater infrastructure and low impact practices in New Mexico through education, policy advocacy, and demonstration projects that benefit both nature and people. And we really do that by engaging the skills and the assets that we have within the community. Our group is a little bit different from the other speakers that you'll hear from today because we're not a municipality. We're a collection of organizations that run the gamut from business to private practice to municipalities and local governments. So we have a lot of different organizations that contribute. We started slow. We created a booklet that was sort of the case studies around green stormwater infrastructure to really start the ball rolling in 2018. We built on that with some interdisciplinary workshops to get landscape architects and stormwater engineers and policymakers and municipal government stormwater managers all talking to each other and understanding the process of a green stormwater infrastructure project and how the timing of when certain contractors engage in the project makes a difference in the outcomes and the benefits that you see in the long term at the end of the project. This was multiplied greatly by or amplified by the New Mexico Department of Transportation adopting new green stormwater infrastructure standards in 2020. And as Blue said, maintenance is always an issue. So we identified early on that maintenance was going to be a barrier for the adoption of green stormwater infrastructure. So we also developed a maintenance manual and training program. And I think in this way, Albuquerque and Tucson are on parallel paths. We also have a number of green stormwater infrastructure projects and really exciting things that are happening that are coming online now. So I wanted to spend a minute to talk about the structure of the coalition and how it is that we function, because it is the members that make this work. So we have a steering committee, and the concept is that the steering committee really is there to facilitate the progress of all of the member organizations. And so we have about 35 member organizations. Some sort of wink in and wink out as they're available, but we usually have about 25 different organizations represented in our quarterly meetings. And any person, member in the coalition can bring forward a project and start a working group. They become a champion of that working group. And usually there's a steering committee member liaison that helps connect the working group with the steering committee so that everybody has that sort of two-way street of communication between what's going on sort of in the field and what's happening at the sort of leadership and guidance role. This is important because it has allowed us to sort of catapult exponentially into a ton of different work. And so one of the things that we did very early on was establish a strategic plan. It was a series of goals and objectives that were quite simple in the beginning, and we're in the process of revising that now that we've hit the 5-year mark. We're ready to sort of dig in and really revamp that. But the idea is that we really are addressing green stormwater infrastructure at 3 levels, with ground-based projects, with community education, and with public policy. And these 3 things came forward as the priorities for the coalition because of the series of studies that were completed in Albuquerque in the early and mid 2000s and even into the 2010s, where researchers were wondering, you know, we've been trying to implement green stormwater infrastructure for a decade or more. Why are we not seeing more of this? What is happening? So those studies really identified clear barriers, some of which were only perceived and some of which were real, about what we needed to do to have intervention in these things and make transformational change on these issues. So I'm just going to bring you through a few of these items to illustrate some of the successes and the challenges that we've had over these years. And again, I just want to highlight that this work is from a team of people, all of the coalition members that have participated in this. So the ground-based project that I want to highlight today is a green stormwater infrastructure project called the Harvey Jones Channel. It treats about 4 to 5 million gallons of stormwater annually through the channel. And the magic of this place happens because we have a permanent water supply. So we have 4 to 5 million gallons of effluent that come through this system daily that now can be used to enhance the sort of microbial and the nature-based solutions, all of the natural assets that occur in this site. When we started, you can see sort of the progression of the pictures across the bottom of the screen. On the left is the starting conditions. It was mostly high and dry. There was really no water there. Most of the vegetation was dead or invasive species. And so we created a series of stormwater channels that's linked to this concrete channel where the effluent comes out in the center of the second picture. And of course is linked to the Rio Grande, so that at high water times, high flow marks in the river, there is some backfill that creates great habitat for fish and other wildlife. We planted about 30,000 willows and 120 cottonwoods were planted by Rio Grande Return. And I'm grateful for Todd Lopez, who just sent me the picture on the far right of the screen, which is the most recent sort of transformational change that you can see on this site, really greening up and really creating fantastic wildlife habitat. This project area is used a lot by recreationalists, and so it really is a benefit to the community. The project budget was about $750,000 total. There was a lot of in-kind match, and we were careful to not actually take any federal money so that there was no nexus with the need to complete any NEPA or National Environmental Policy Act environmental regulations. So that helped us speed the timeline along and get this project done in about a year and a half. COVID did slow us down a little bit, but it was really a great example of how a very large green stormwater infrastructure project can work across multiple agencies. I also want to highlight the community education and outreach. This is one of our primary working groups. And one of the other things that we've done, similar to what they're doing in Tucson with the grassroots elevation of and knowledge of green stormwater infrastructure, is the residential rainwater harvesting workshops, which are co-hosted among Bernalillo County, the Water Authority, and the Arid LID Coalition, along with many other partners, including Ciudad Soil and Water Conservation District. These started as a grant-funded project that then was able to be repeated. So now there's such demand for these things that I think it will become an annual, if not more frequently presented workshop. I also want to highlight that a few years ago, we started the first ever Green Stormwater Infrastructure Award in New Mexico, which was really a fun process. You can see an example of one of the award winners in the conceptual design phase of the planning process. And also tying in the maintenance piece, because as we know that this is a really important concept that often gets overlooked. We created a stormwater maintenance guide, and that guide and the videos are available. The guide is available on the Arid LID website, and the videos are being hosted by Bernalillo County website, and those should be up any day now. Finally, I just wanted to talk about the Pueblo Alto Mile High Neighborhood Drainage Study, because this is an important project that was put forward by Groundwork Studio as another member, and Bohannon Houston, and in partnership with the city of Albuquerque. they really changed the way that the city of Albuquerque is approaching communities in doing green stormwater infrastructure, and the ability to educate communities at a neighborhood scale while planning for nuisance flooding issues and all of the benefits that you get from multimodal transportation interventions and other green stormwater infrastructure assets. Finally, I just want to talk about the public policy. Again, I'll just mention the New Mexico Department of Transportation discharge stormwater management guidelines that came out. This was really an important sort of tipping point in the advancement of adoption from an agency scale. They manage over 215,000 acres of land across New Mexico. And now with these regulations, it helps really clean the water that's coming off of our highways and our streets across New Mexico. So that was a great turning point in supporting that process with review by the coalition in the development of these guidelines. Bernalillo County followed suit. They already had these in process, and they are developing their own green stormwater infrastructure, low impact development standards. There should be in front of the county commissioners in the next month. And we're hoping to elevate those regulatory influences as well. And finally, I just want to mention that we don't have the benefit of funding as Blue does in Tucson. And so we are working on a grant proposal right now, seeking funding for a feasibility analysis for a GSI fund, figuring out what the socioeconomic structure might look like, who would manage it, how much would it generate, and how it would be implemented. So I'll stop there because I'm already over time, and I really thank you for the opportunity to speak here and share some of our successes from the coalition. And you can get in touch with us this way. I'm hoping the community members that are online can post the links to all of these great resources that you guys have.
Thank you, Sarah. It's really great to hear about the collaborative efforts and interest in green infrastructure in Albuquerque and the surrounding area. Next up, I'm pleased to introduce Sarah Anderson for our final presentation today. Sarah manages the Office of Green Infrastructure in Denver's Department of Transportation and Infrastructure Utilities Administration. She's responsible for creating a strategic, innovative stormwater program with a focus on green infrastructure implementation. We're excited to hear about the work you've been leading. Take it away, Sarah.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. It was interesting to hear from the entire panel, and it's interesting. Our presentations share very similar pathways for people to develop green infrastructure programs. I also want to thank each of you on the call as participants and taking the time to hear about green infrastructure in the Southwest. Today, I'm going to focus and highlight very briefly the evolution of Denver's green infrastructure program. Starting with on this slide, you'll see that cross-through mark. We're just transitioning this year from the Office of Green Infrastructure into the Division of Green Infrastructure. And this is really direction recently set from our executive director to create a 10-year vision for green infrastructure in Denver that elevates green infrastructure so that green infrastructure is seen as critical infrastructure, as important to the livability of our city as trash collection, functioning storm sewers, and effective transportation network. Next slide, please. But how did we get here? It really wasn't very long ago that Denver did not have a standalone green infrastructure program or dedicated funding. It was only in 2016 that green infrastructure received a funding source from a stormwater rate increase. Now, that's not to say before 2016 that there was a group of very talented engineers and staff members working on water quality and enforcing stormwater regulations through our MS4 permit. But 2016 was the first time, well, really 2017, when we first got our first allotment of money, was the first time we ever had dedicated funding for green infrastructure. So we went from $0 to $21 million. With that money, we've been very successful at matching our program dollars, dollar for dollar. We have a philosophy in the Division of Green Infrastructure that we never do a project alone, and we always have a funding partner or partners. And so you can see in that funding wheel some of our partners. Of the $21 million, we've put in $18 million of capital, and we've matched that money with $18 million of other people's money. Our partners are the Colorado Department of Transportation, our Wastewater Operations Division, Denver Public Schools, Denver Public Libraries, but a real partner for us that we have a lot of success to is Denver Parks and Recreation. They've been great partners in the development of our green infrastructure program. And because of the success of this first capital program from 2016 to 2021, and the return on that initial investment, we've now doubled our budget this year, starting in 2022 through 2027, and have $43 million for a capital program. I hope to report out in 2028 that we've matched our program two to one and have put in 90, 100, $110 million in green infrastructure. It was great to see Tucson's funding source. That's really exciting because I think that the dedicated funding for communities not in combined systems or who don't have consent decrees, it's harder to come up with that funding. But Denver is really dedicated to the implementation of green infrastructure to mitigate the impacts of climate change. On this next slide, you'll see a planning tool similar, it looks like, to the tree equity score used in Tucson, but this we call the water quality scorecard. And this was really key to the success of receiving that first dedicated funding in 2016. In 2014 and 2015, as we shopped our fee proposal to council and other stakeholders, the scorecard was a pivotal tool and was really a data-driven approach to showcase where we would put green infrastructure and where it was most needed, and how we could really meet a number of other citywide goals by implementing green infrastructure in these priority basins first. So priority basins are the orange and red. Unlike Tucson, we really beat the drum that green infrastructure is not equitable. And I don't mean that Tucson didn't do that, but we didn't divide the money equally among council districts, which I think is very common. We really said, green infrastructure has not been implemented equitably across the city, and this could maybe attempt just to level the playing field, even just a little bit. And so interestingly enough, 2 years later, Dottie created an equity index that, not surprisingly, looks very similar to this map. And I don't really have time to go through each of the criteria that was used to bake this heat map, but I'm happy to share more on the scorecard with anyone who's interested. From the scorecard on the next slide, we developed engineering criteria that really we didn't have before, and criteria that was needed for tight, urban, dense spaces. So we developed the ultra urban green infrastructure guidelines, and this detailed 6 practices that could be used in our right of way, and has really changed how we do green infrastructure along our streets. From there, in 2018, we developed a green infrastructure implementation strategy, a master plan of sorts. And this really just built upon the scorecard and identified green street opportunities, as you can see in the orange and yellow, and regional opportunities on city-owned land, including in our parks, where green infrastructure could be built. You'll see on this next slide a handful of our projects. The top row are regional projects we've built, mostly again in parks. I want to highlight their partnership. And then the bottom row are a number of projects that we've built along our streets. Next slide. So what have we accomplished in that 5 or 6 year budget, depending on how you look at it? We have spent 80% of that $18 million in priority basins, And because those maps overlap so much, that is also 80% in Dottie's equity index. We have built over 13.7 miles of green streets, which we have a calculation of how we meet a mile. And that's 2.7 miles of green streets a year. Now, we have a goal, an ambitious goal, I would say, of 5 miles of green streets a year. So we are falling short. We've also provided 7,700 acres of stormwater treatment in basins where no water quality treatment had previously been implemented. Now, as you can see in that pie chart, the OGI funding, I'm using my cursor, which you guys can't see, only accounts for 45% of that treatment. 55% is from other city projects. So I just want to highlight that while Denver does have a green infrastructure division, it's hard to get to say that, we also implement a lot of green infrastructure outside of our program. And one of these projects was a really impressive, I welcome you to Google it, a $300 million gray-green stormwater project called the Platte to Park Hill. And that Platte to Park Hill project was responsible for about 4,000 acres of that treatment. Next slide. But as I've mentioned, in 2022, our budget has doubled nearly, and we're falling short of delivering on those 5 miles of green streets. So we really, in the last 2 years, rethought our approach, especially in light of the emerging climate crisis, and really thinking about how we could reach those areas of the city that have green infrastructure investment to not only manage stormwater, but to also start to mitigate rising temperatures. Denver, like everyone, is likely warming faster than we'd like. So we put out new guidelines called the Denver Green Continuum Streets. And this builds upon the ultra-urban green infrastructure guide and our implementation strategy to really introduce what we call 5 levels of green. And because what we had been doing before is really 1 level of green, well, maybe 2. We were doing nothing, or we were building facilities that provided regulatory water quality capture volumes. And those facilities are incredibly expensive and incredibly time consuming. And we felt and we knew that there must be values of different green infrastructure interventions along that continuum of doing nothing or meeting a water quality capture volume. And so we reached out to our partners, local universities, other municipalities, to see if anyone had any engineering criteria or data around the stormwater benefits of just depressing landscapes a few inches, or allowing water to flow through landscapes, or even allowing water to infiltrate just a little bit versus being stored. We didn't get much back as far as actual data. And so we brought this effort in-house and really did a robust modeling effort and modeled over 600 interventions and configurations of different stormwater control measures to really prove out the benefits of these different levels, and as well as to kind of differentiate the levels. Next slide. And so here is the levels that we've identified in the green continuum. Level of green 1 is just about planting trees and proper soil volumes, and we detailed that for our partners who are trying to grow urban tree canopies. But for us, we're really going to focus on levels of green 2 through 5, because level of green 2 really has really have some clear stormwater benefits. And since we're funded through the stormwater fee, that's where we feel comfortable starting. So you can see in level of green 2, it's just about shallow infiltrating landscapes. These are landscapes that are depressed 2 to 4 inches, and they take sidewalk drainage. Level of green 3, we start to introduce water to flow through the landscape. You can see in that picture on the right, that's another leader in green infrastructure in Colorado, which is Fort Collins. They do a lot of these flow through landscapes. We've not yet done any. I have a sneaky suspicion this is going to be my favorite level moving forward. And we have a number of projects in design that are actually a mix and match of all these levels so that we can test them. But level of green 4, we start to infiltrate the water and the native subgrade below. Obviously, your soils will be very important in that. But this is useful for parts of our city, which there's a lot of Denver that doesn't have underground gray infrastructure systems. So these will be useful in those areas where we can just infiltrate the stormwater. And of course, there's level of green 5, which we continue to keep for our projects that must meet regulatory control measures. You can see in the picture on the lower right, we've put in about 250 of these street side stormwater planters over the last 5 years. So we'll continue to be a very valuable tool in our toolbox. Next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned, we modeled all of these interventions and all at different configurations, different levels, and each of the levels have runoff reduction benefits. But we're also really curious because one of our biggest challenges right now is rising temperatures. And we really wanted to understand what green infrastructure could do to mitigate our rising urban temperatures. And so again, we looked for some local data, couldn't find it. So we modeled a lot of temperature in our office and came up with this on the lower left-hand side, this box plot, which really shows that if you increase your tree canopy by 10%, you can expect to see a 2-degree decrease in your land surface temperatures. Now, up to that 10% is your greatest benefit. So that's really where we're going to focus our efforts, is getting, starting with getting green infrastructure on our streets and equity areas with less than 10%. So we've remapped the city from our initial scorecard effort, which only looked at those 11 basins. Now we're looking at the entire city since we have a greater toolbox. We've identified our water quality green streets, and these are streets in those priority basins generally, or streets we expect that will have enough reconstruction that they'll be regulatory. And on those projects, we'll continue to use the levels of green 4 and 5. But then we also map the city for the hottest streets. And so on those streets, we really anticipate using more of the level greens 2 and 3. I think this is my final slide, and the whole reason and intention behind doing this is so that we can spread our program budget further and the benefits further. You can see in this slide on runoff, if we built 3 miles of level of green 2, it would be the equivalent of 1 mile of level of green 5. So stretching those benefits, you can see on the dollars, right? If we build 4 miles of level of green 2, it's roughly the equivalent of only 1 mile of level of green 5. And so the intent is to implement green infrastructure faster so we can mitigate and adapt to our warming climate. And hopefully we'll start to meet that goal of implementing 5 miles of green streets, certainly focused on Dottie's in areas in Dottie's equity index and within our own priority basins. And with that, that's what Denver is up to. I'll turn it back over to you, Rebecca, for questions.
Great, thank you. So we are looking forward to getting to the audience questions, but before that, we actually have some questions for the audience. So we're going to put in a poll. So if everybody could take a couple of moments to read the question and answer it. We have 2 questions here for everyone. The first is, what types of case studies and examples would you like to see that highlight green infrastructure and nature-based solutions? It's multiple choice, but in this case, you can pick more than one. So we have federal and state collaboration, municipal green stormwater infrastructure solutions, partnerships between universities, NGOs, and communities, coordinating funding from multiple sources, workforce development, long-term operations and maintenance, and then green infrastructure and environmental justice. I see lots of participation, which is fantastic. So once you have finished the first question, you can go down to our second question. what do you consider to be the dominant hazard in the Southwest that green infrastructure and nature-based solutions needs to address? We've been asking these poll questions in all of our webinars, so they may seem familiar if you've attended previous webinars, as well as having the same answers for consistency. So you may be wondering if coastal resilience is totally relevant in the Southwest. So we recognize, but we wanted to have all our answers the same. Great, well, it looks like, oh, we've got a couple more people answering. I'll give it just a couple more seconds. All right, I'm going to close it in 5 seconds. Make your choices now. Okay, we're closing that. And we will share the results right now. So you can see that people want to hear about municipal green stormwater infrastructure solutions, also long-term operations and maintenance, as well as green infrastructure and environmental justice as kind of the top 3 options. Let's see what the dominant hazard is. So we see drought and then extreme heat. So really interesting. We will make these results available to everyone who is on the webinar. So we'll share these results with all of you. So I will stop sharing the poll results now. And then we will move into the Q&A. So if our panelists would like to turn on their cameras, that would be great. And I want to thank all the panelists for answering so many questions in the Q&A box. You all are doing a great job answering everything. So we'll get to lots of questions. I think what I will do is start with my first question, and then I'm going to pass it over to Lydia to ask a question, and then we'll get back on track. So kind of in general, what motivates communities living in the Southwest to adopt and or expand green infrastructure and nature-based solutions in the region? And I think, Blue, you were going to start us off with that one.
Sure. So as I mentioned briefly in my presentation, the Storm to Shade program was not formed to address water quality specifically. It was formed in an effort to be the most responsible with our complete portfolio of water resources as we can be. And so by harvesting stormwater, we're really offsetting demand on our potable water resources for landscape irrigation use. And so what we're really trying to do is grab water as locally as we possibly can, put it back into the ground as locally as we possibly can to support urban greening. So that's really the bottom line motivation for our program.
Great. And then Sarah Anderson, do you want to take it next?
Sure, we do have a MS4 permit, certainly water quality concerns in our one river, and a TMDL. But you know, I would say that beyond that, the Denver voters are really leading the green charge in Denver. There's been at least 4 large-scale initiatives that have passed in the last 5 years around developing a climate office, a dedicated funding for parks, and a mill levy for green stormwater infrastructure and flood control. So they're really demanding more of us from the government standpoint, and we're trying to step up to the charge.
Great. And then Sarah.
Yeah, Albuquerque comes at it at a little different angle, which is it started with the MS4 permitting, as I mentioned. But I think really what it's come down to is how can we, similar to what Blue was saying, how can we use stormwater as an asset instead of a liability? And really that's what the coalition has been talking about since its inception 5 years ago, is really trying to use, water in the desert is too precious to only use it once and then let it roll away and go downstream. We need to figure out ways to reuse it multiple times and get as much benefit out of it as we can before we send it on its way. And I say that also wanting to recognize that we need water in the river too, because that is a valuable asset in itself. So it's twofold. It's about using the water as best we can with what little we have, and also protecting it from the stormwater pollution in our waterways and protecting those natural habitats. So those are the primary reasons why Albuquerque is deeply working on these issues. But there's so many other co-benefits that come from green stormwater infrastructure that we've just barely touched on. We've talked a little bit about shade and urban heat island mitigation. We haven't talked at all about the impacts on human health and the benefits of nearby nature and how people respond and are healthier and happier and all of those things when you have these little features nearby. And it doesn't have to be sort of a giant park of wilderness out there. It can be a little green stormwater infrastructure feature in your neighborhood that you walk past every day or teach your kids about on their way to school. And it's really just such a valuable asset to the community that we need to think about how these distributed features can really integrate into the network of benefits and assets across the city.
Really helpful. And then I think that there might be a specific question related to Sarah Anderson, some of your projects. So Lydia, if you want to go ahead and ask your question directly, go for it.
Sure. You talked a lot about modeling that was done to understand the stormwater and heat impacts of different types of green stormwater infrastructure. And I was curious if you have any ability or have done any monitoring and actually started to measure the outcomes and see if it lines up with what you're seeing, since that is a big gap. There isn't sufficient data out there. And so if you are able to do that, that would be fantastic.
We do have a fairly robust, albeit new, monitoring program that we do in coordination with our Department of Public Health and Environment, where we have 3 types of tests we do. We do synthetic runoff tests where we can control the amount of water that we put into these planters. We do water quality monitoring and infiltration testing as well. So we hope to, especially as we start to mix and match the levels of green, we'll also monitor those to see if they align with our modeling efforts. And we're in talks with developing a scope with the USGS and getting some long-term empirical data on one of our projects that is coming out of the gates along Federal Boulevard, where we'll do about 2 miles of green infrastructure to really look at the long-term benefits of green infrastructure, not so much from a water quality or stormwater management perspective, but really from a heat mitigation. We're going to do a lot of temperature studies. They have alluded to us that they don't have any long-term temperature studies. So we're going to attempt to do that and then try to find some more qualitative data, right? It's in an area, a Vietnamese community where there's a lot of restaurants but it's just almost 100% impervious, right? And so does that increase people walking around these businesses, getting to and from the shops? Do they feel more comfortable on their bicycles, taking the bus? So we hope to collect some of that data too, although we haven't quite figured that out. So if anyone has any information or ideas on how to collect more of that qualitative data, I'd really appreciate it.
Great, thank you. And I think some of your remarks lead into another question that we hear frequently about water quality and water quantity challenges. So what kinds of water quality and quantity challenges do communities in the Southwest face? And what are some of those benefits that green infrastructure and nature-based solutions provide. And maybe Sarah Hurto, you would like to take a little bit to expand since you referenced that.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so water quantity obviously is an issue in the Southwest. We're all very limited. And as the IPCC reports are indicating for the Southwest, it's going to get less likely, and our monsoon could change. Our monsoon patterns could change. So the majority of our rainwater does come during the monsoon season. And if that shifts and changes, then it changes the patterns of what vegetation it would support and how we need to build these infrastructure features, the size of the volume, the first flush runoff to capture stormwater pollution and other aspects. So it's complicated to try to do all of these things at one time. And, you know, I am lucky to be part of the coalition that has so many brilliant people in it to help us think through these things. So there's, we rely on water quality. I'm going to switch to water quality now. We rely mostly on the MS4 permit requirements of testing, which the permittees do an excellent job of. They're very well coordinated. So there's, you know, like I said, 15 or so agencies that are all collecting data within their jurisdictions under the same permit, because our plumbing system is integrated so it can flow from the city to the county to the flood control district to the, you know, in between all of the things. So so they do a really great job, and we rely heavily on that MS4 monitoring data for water quality issues. And those agencies have also been very focused on water quality stations. So getting rid of the big trash pieces. They've done a very good job of that. And now we're working on sort of the treatment train, where now we have the big infrastructure in place that is collecting, you know, the big chunks of things that are floating down our waterways and in our arroyos when we have stormwater. And now we're building in the green stormwater sort of behind those other features to collect the smaller particles as the water moves through.
And then Blue or Sarah, do you want to share about your water quality and water quantity focus?
Sure. So as far as water quantity, I think we've touched on that for Tucson. This program is really about, you know, not touching our potable groundwater for landscape use. As far as water quality is concerned, we know that we're capturing pollutants and filtering them out via GSI features. The other interesting piece, which Sarah Hurto was just referring to, is that one about trash. And there actually was a little program that was happening in South Tucson, which is actually a separate city in Tucson. So our program doesn't work there, but an organization called the Sonoran Institute was looking into the potential impacts of building green stormwater infrastructure as trash mitigation, as that being one of its primary purposes. And so we're experiencing a lot of trash in Tucson these days, and it's all flowing into our major waterways. But if we can capture it in small quantities along the way, if we have a maintenance force intact that can address that, so that collecting trash is part of their regular maintenance checklist, then we can help impact our water quality that way.
Great. And I see that, of course, we're already getting short on time. So I did want to talk a little bit about frontline communities. So hearing a little bit more about how are the environmental, health, social, and economic benefits from green infrastructure and nature-based solutions leveraged to support frontline communities. And then if anyone has any thoughts or information about the idea of green gentrification. So how introducing more green infrastructure and nature-based solutions into communities can change the demographics of a community. And so how are you all thinking about that, and what kind of resources are out there?
Well, I can jump in. You know, ours has been evolving over time. Like I showed in that water quality scorecard, which was done in 2014. We tried to factor in equity from a green infrastructure standpoint. And really all we knew to do at the time was to use income levels that we got through HUD. Not a very robust or sophisticated look at equity, but it was pretty early in looking at it, and certainly from a green infrastructure planning tool. You know, like I mentioned, a few years later, Dottie has an equity index map where we're trying to focus all of our capital projects, right? Streetlights, sidewalks, schools, you know, all the things. You know, and the mayor's office certainly has a lot of initiatives too. They have an equity and inclusion office. And then and these are not my areas of expertise by any stretch of the imagination, but there is a housing stability office that is really trying to address those same things. Because it's undeniable, right, that investment often leads to gentrification. I think that, you know, likely don't have it solved, but we are trying to work on that. And then lastly, our climate action and sustainability and resiliency office has just recently developed some actual frontline community maps as it relates to climate change. So we're trying to identify where the problems are and showcase our investments there. But I'm not the subject matter expertise on how you circumvent gentrification.
I'll just go ahead and dovetail with Sarah Anderson. Displacement and gentrification are such complex problems with so many different drivers. And our, you know, in Tucson, our small little green stormwater infrastructure program is really involved in that conversation, and something that we think about all the time, but we don't yet have a tool set developed for how we deal with that. It is something that as in Denver, the mayor's office is very focused on, and we now have an equity officer who's very focused on, and housing community development is very focused on it. And so we're working towards solutions because obviously we don't want to be displacing people because we're improving the environment in which they live. We want them to be able to stay and enjoy the fruits of those improvements. And so, yeah, it's a complex problem. We're always looking for resources. So if anybody has anything to share about this, please reach out.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and add that in Albuquerque, we don't have enough of these green stormwater infrastructure distributed features yet to actually trigger any sort of gentrification. We're at this point still trying to rectify the issue of the lack of infrastructure in low-income communities that's causing this nuisance flooding and depressing these neighborhoods of working class and low-income and communities of color. So right now we're just trying to like level the playing field for some of these folks. But as Blue said, we want to make sure that that the people that are living there in those neighborhoods can continue to live there even as we build out the network of these assets.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to hear and know that it's in the front of mind as municipalities, communities, and other public-private partnerships are developing. We're coming to the end. We don't really have time for anything more in the question bucket, but in many of our conversations and planning for this webinar and getting to know all of you, I do know that there's been discussion about some of the need for more research and data that can really help inform green infrastructure and nature-based solutions in the Southwest. And that there's a real interest and need for regionally specific strategies. One thing Sarah Hurto and I had talked a bit about is Even calling it green infrastructure in the Southwest can be confusing and misleading because often it isn't green, it's brown because of the ecosystem and nature of the plants. So there's lots more to think about and talk about. We will save the chat and provide it as a PDF to all attendees. So no stress there. You'll get all the resources that were shared. We'll also share all the questions and answers that our panelists did a wonderful job answering while we were all talking. And there will be a recording of this webinar. So all of that will be posted. The recording and the bios will be posted, and the attendees will get the chat and the answers to some of those questions that came in. Before you leave, we have another poll for you. So if you can go ahead and launch the poll. We have a few questions, and these help us improve on our webinars. So if you can just take a couple of moments again to answer these questions. And as you do that, I will say thank you to our panelists. So really appreciate Lydia Olander joining from the White House, Sarah Anderson from Denver, Sarah Hurto from her work in Albuquerque, and then Blue from Tucson, Arizona. It's fantastic to hear about the efforts, the work, and the ongoing need for information around green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. This is the 5th webinar in our regional series. We have 1 to go. So in the next month or so, we'll be hosting our final webinar in the Northwest of the US. So we're looking forward to continuing to connect with all of our attendees and the many, many folks working in green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. So as we close out, I will welcome any of the panelists to say one thing or an idea around what you're most excited about for green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. So what can we get excited about coming soon? And Lydia, you can join too if you would, if you have something that really excites you that you'd like to share.
I'll jump in first. I'm really excited about the idea of the feasibility analysis of a green stormwater infrastructure fund that we're doing now. And if there's anybody out there that's interested in working in Albuquerque and helping us with research and these monitoring data issues, please reach out to me. We would love to work with you.
I am very excited by the support of the federal government in developing these initiatives.
I'm happy to jump in after that. Yeah, I'm very excited to see that there's kind of leadership interest in this. I think the amount of resources that are flowing through the federal government in the near term and the opportunities to turn those towards nature-based solutions and really accelerate the pace of what's happening, to me, is extremely exciting.
And I can dovetail with that sentiment. There Lydia goes again from the White House saying nature-based solutions, and I just get so excited about that. The fact that we've finally come to a point when we're recognizing that we need to embrace what nature can do for us, and not just for us, but as we work with nature, nature works with us, and this sort of circular relationship that humans have with the natural world. So I think it's just great that we're thinking about that as a policy, decision, but also that it really resonates with us as human beings.
Thank you. Well, that's a perfect note to close on. So we hope that you will join us for the Northwest. We have recordings of all the webinars. We can share those through our thank you email for attending. So you'll have links to all our previous regional webinars. And just want to thank the presenters and all the attendees for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure. And as fall sets in different parts of the world, I hope everyone is doing well. And thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Rebecca.